The New York-Washington, D.C. high-speed train sat gleaming on the platform, ready to cut through the East Coast at 150 miles per hour. Inside the first-class cabin was quiet and polished, with wide leather seats, polished walnut trim, and soft, amber lighting. Passengers were settling in with newspapers, coffee in hand, expecting a smooth and uneventful ride. Then Karoline Leavitt stepped in. Wearing a modest navy blazer and carrying a slim leather briefcase, she moved with quiet confidence, neither flashy nor arrogant. She wasn't here to make a scene. Just another American, on business. But heads turned. Some recognized her instantly. 27 years old, the White House press secretary. A rising star in conservative politics. Calm, composed, and unmistakably out of place to those who already judged her without a word spoken. From the far end of the cabin, Caleb Morris emerged, the chief conductor of the train. Mid-50s, tall, sharp features, and a demeanor that suggested control and authority. But the moment his eyes landed on Karoline, a shadow crossed his face. He approached with brisk steps and a smirk. "First class," he said coldly, loud enough for others to hear, "is for leaders, not political mouthpieces." The cabin fell silent. Passengers looked up. An elderly gentleman lowered his USA Today. A woman across the aisle leaned forward. Tension thickened like storm clouds. Karoline paused. Her face didn't flinch. But for older viewers watching this unfold, those who remembered dignity, respect, and the cost of freedom, Caleb's words weren't just rude. They were an insult. And in that moment they knew this young woman didn't just walk into a train car. She walked into a fight she didn't start, but one she just might finish. Karoline Leavitt remained seated, her hands folded neatly over the ticket she had already shown the platform staff. First-class aisle seat, car 1A. She had nothing to hide and nothing to prove. But that didn't stop Caleb Morris from stepping into the aisle with all the subtlety of a spotlight. "I said," he repeated louder this time, "this cabin is for qualified passengers. You'll need to move." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the surrounding seats. A woman in her 60s whispered, "That's the White House girl, isn't it?" While a man in a wool blazer huffed, "She probably thinks she's above the rules." Karoline didn't flinch. She looked up, her voice even and respectful. "Sir, I have a valid first-class ticket. You're welcome to scan it again." Caleb didn't reach for the scanner. He waved a dismissive hand instead, his tone now tinged with disdain. "I don't need to check. I know who you are." That sentence hung in the air like smoke after a shot. "I know what you represent," he continued, voice now rising for the benefit of the audience gathering around. "That cross around your neck, your boss in the White House, your weekly rants on cable news. This is a space for real thinkers, not political theater." A few passengers nodded, chuckled even. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their sense of decency stirred. Karoline's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, her expression unreadable but focused. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Is that how Amtrak trains operate now?" she asked calmly. "Assigning seats based on beliefs instead of bookings?" Caleb scoffed, ignoring her question. "I'm the senior conductor on this train. I decide who belongs where. You can take this up with management after you move back." Again, he gestured toward coach like it was exile. Someone from the next row, a retired Marine by the look of the Semper Fi pin on his lapel, leaned forward. "She's got a right to be here if she paid for the seat," he muttered. But Caleb wasn't listening. His pride had now taken the wheel. "I've seen your type." He spat quieter now, but close enough for Karoline to hear. "You think quoting the Constitution gives you a free pass to stomp all over progress." This time, Karoline set her ticket carefully on the tray table. She straightened her posture, not to look taller, but to make sure every word landed with the weight it deserved. "You don't have to agree with me, Mr. Morris," she said evenly. But you will respect my right to sit in the seat I paid for, or explain to the public why you removed a U.S. official based on your political bias." The words were measured, controlled, but they cut like glass. A hush fell over the cabin. Caleb stood frozen for a split second, his face twitching as his authority slowly eroded in real time. The eyes of the cabin, young and old, were no longer laughing or whispering. They were watching. "Security can be called." Caleb snapped back now, flustered. "You're disrupting the cabin." A woman near the window stood. She was older, maybe in her 70s, her southern accent faint, but steady. "No, sir. You're the one causing the disruption." She hasn't raised her voice once. That changed something. Now a middle-aged black man in a Veterans Affairs hat nodded. "I didn't vote for her boss," he said slowly, "but she's got every right to sit in that seat. This ain't the 50s, man." Caleb's face flushed crimson. Karoline said nothing more. She sat still, composed. But her silence now carried a weight that filled the cabin. She had refused to be baited. She had refused to fold. And the contrast between her dignity and Caleb's behavior was becoming undeniable. Still, he tried one last jab. "You talk about rights," he said bitterly. "But some people use them as shields to hide their ignorance." Karoline finally turned to face him squarely, her voice low but cutting, "And some abuse their uniforms to hide their prejudice." A collective oof spread through the cabin. Caleb staggered back half a step as though struck without contact. The train had barely left the station, but the first battle had already been waged, and the lines were clear. Karoline didn't gloat. She didn't blink. She simply lifted her phone and typed a brief message, then returned it to the tray table beside her untouched coffee. Outside, the train gave a gentle lurch forward. But inside Car 1A, the atmosphere was far from smooth. It was charged with something deeper, an electric sense that the story unfolding wasn't about seating anymore. It was about who belonged, and who gets to decide. The high-speed train raced past the outskirts of Philadelphia, but inside Car 1A time seemed to slow. The tension between Caleb Morris and Karoline Leavitt was no longer just a quiet power struggle, it was now a collision course. Caleb walked the aisle with exaggerated purpose, a steaming paper cup of coffee in hand. He made a show of greeting other passengers lingering by their seats, his voice overly pleasant, trying perhaps to pretend the standoff hadn't just humiliated him. But then he reached Karoline's row again. She was seated quietly, a book open on her lap, her blazer freshly brushed, and a graceful composure on her face that hadn't wavered since boarding. Her presence seemed to challenge Caleb in a way words never could. And that's when it happened. Without warning, without even a glance, Caleb turned sharply as he passed. His elbow swung wide accidentally, knocking the edge of the coffee cup. In one swift, calculated flick, the entire contents spilled downward. A sharp gasp shot through the cabin as the hot liquid splattered across Karoline's skirt. Time froze. You could hear the hum of the engine, the clink of a spoon in the next car, the rustle of a newspaper. But inside Car 1A, no one breathed. The elderly woman 2 seats over clutched her pearl's eyes wide. The Marine veteran bolted upright. A young mother covered her mouth. Even the child next to her looked confused and afraid. It wasn't just coffee. It was intent. Karoline slowly looked down at the spreading stain on her lap. Her skirt was soaked, the fabric darkened by the spill, a few drops still sliding toward the floor. She reached calmly for a napkin, dabbed at the fabric, not frantically, but with surgical precision. Then she looked up. Her gaze met Caleb's with such icy clarity he visibly recoiled. "You just made," she said softly, "the worst mistake of your career." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They carried the weight of a gavel, striking wood. Final, echoing. Caleb froze. For the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. He stammered. It was an accident. No, it wasn't, a voice said. It wasn't Karoline. It came from the other side of the aisle. The Marine. I've seen men do worse things in uniform, but they at least had the guts to admit it. His tone wasn't angry. It was disappointed. The silence cracked into murmurs, low, shocked, rippling through the car like a rising storm. The woman with the pearls whispered to her husband. She didn't even flinch. Someone behind them muttered, "He did that on purpose. I saw it." Caleb tried to speak again, but no one was listening. Karoline slowly stood, careful not to wrinkle the fabric more than necessary. She looked Caleb squarely in the eyes, her voice now slightly firmer. "You've embarrassed yourself. You've dishonored this train. And you've insulted not just me, but every woman who's ever been shamed in public by a man misusing power." Her words hung in the air. "I suggest you step aside now before this gets worse." Caleb blinked, then took a half step back but still tried to salvage control. "Look, I didn't mean, maybe I overstepped." Another voice cut him off, this time from the PA system above. It crackled to life, startling the cabin. "Mr. Morris, please report to the conductor's office immediately. Management has been notified." All eyes turned upward. The announcement had come from the lead operator of the train. Caleb's jaw clenched. He looked around and saw not one sympathetic face. No ally, no out. Karoline didn't say another word. She didn't gloat. She just stood there, her wet skirt a badge of composure, her dignity fully intact. An elderly man near the rear began clapping. Slowly. Then another joined in. And another. The applause wasn't raucous. It wasn't political. It was respectful. For grace, for restraint, for standing tall without needing to shout. Caleb turned and walked away, his steps uneven, his career already unraveling behind him. As he disappeared through the door to the next car, Karoline sat back down. She adjusted her seat, took out a small towel from her bag and quietly resumed reading her book, now resting over the damp fabric. The passengers watched in awe. The Marine leaned in and said, "You didn't just win that, you showed the rest of us how to handle evil when it wears a smile." Karoline nodded once. "Thank you, sir. Sometimes the strongest weapon is silence." The train roared forward at 150 miles per hour. But in that moment inside Car 1A, the world had stopped long enough for truth to settle in. The train continued to cut through the landscape at nearly 150 miles per hour. But inside Car 1A, the tension still clung to the air like static after a storm. Caleb Morris, the head conductor who had just humiliated the White House press secretary Karoline Leavitt with a steaming cup of coffee, had been summoned away by an urgent call from the control cabin. He disappeared down the corridor, his steps hollow, his authority in tatters. The passengers remained hushed, still digesting what they had just witnessed. Karoline, her skirt still damp, sat composed and regal, dignity undented, presence unmatched. Across from her, the Marine veteran gave a respectful nod. Nearby, an older woman whispered to her husband, "I don't know who that young lady really is, but she's someone important. You can just feel it." Then it happened. Less than 2 minutes after Caleb vanished into the next car, the intercom buzzed once again. This time the voice wasn't shaky or panicked. It was calm, composed, and heavy with command. "Attention, all passengers, we will be making an unscheduled stop at Wilmington Station. Please remain seated. This is a routine check requested by upper management." A few murmurs floated through the cabin, but most sat still, unsure what to expect. 10 minutes later, the train coasted into Wilmington. The brakes hissed, the engine eased down, and the platform rolled into view. Suddenly, the doors of Car 1A opened, and a man in a crisp gray suit stepped aboard. Behind him, a younger aide followed, holding a leather binder. The older gentleman stood tall, his hair silver, his posture military straight. His badge identified him as Harold Grant, Senior Vice President of Leavitt Transportation Holdings. Every eye in the car locked on him. He didn't waste time. He looked down at a printed sheet in his hand, then up his eyes meeting Karoline's. "Miss Leavitt," he said respectfully, "I've just received confirmation from Mr. Richard Leavitt. He extends his personal apologies for what you've endured." A hush swept the cabin. The older woman gasped, clutching her scarf. "Did he just say Richard Leavitt?" The man nodded once, then turned to address the room. "For those who may not know," he continued, "Karoline Leavitt is the daughter of Richard Leavitt, founder and sole owner of this train company." Gasps rippled through the car like a wave crashing against steel. A businessman near the back muttered, "No wonder she didn't lose her temper." A college student fumbled with his phone, too stunned to even record. Even the Marine's eyes widened with newfound respect. "Well, I'll be damned," he said under his breath. Karoline stood brushing a few creases from her skirt still wet from Caleb's stunt. But now the moment belonged entirely to her. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply looked at Harold and gave a firm nod. "Thank you. I'm glad the truth has come forward." Then calmly she turned to the stunned passengers. "I didn't board this train expecting to make a statement," she said. "I had a ticket just like anyone else. I didn't ask for favors, and I didn't demand special treatment." Her voice was calm but carried power. "But today wasn't about me. It was about what happens when people use their position to belittle, dismiss, or mistreat others because of who they think someone is." She paused, letting the silence carry her words like a tide. "Caleb Morris didn't know who I was. And frankly, that's not the point. What matters is that he treated someone he assumed had no power like they didn't deserve basic respect. That's the issue." The entire car was silent now. The older woman began clapping. Then the Marine. Then everyone. Harold turned to Karoline. "Per Mr. Leavitt's instructions, Caleb Morris has been relieved of duty effective immediately. A formal investigation will follow, and a public apology will be issued before the day is out." Karoline nodded once more. "That's fair." Just then, Caleb re-entered the car, flanked by a junior supervisor. He stopped short, confusion flashing across his face when he saw Harold standing beside Karoline. His eyes darted between them, desperate to understand. "What's going on?" he asked, voice thin. Harold stepped forward. "Caleb Morris, you are hereby removed from your duties. You will exit the train now." Caleb's eyes went wide. "What, wait, I didn't know who she was. I thought she was just a woman," Karoline interjected softly. "Just someone beneath your attention." Caleb had no words. He stood frozen, embarrassment spreading like wildfire across his face. Passengers watched as he was escorted off the train. No one looked away, not even the elderly woman with the scarf. Her voice, gentle but sharp, floated after him. "Next time, treat people with dignity before you know their last name." Karoline sat down once more. The train pulled away from Wilmington Station lighter somehow. Not because justice had fully been served, but because the truth had surfaced in a way no one could ignore. Karoline Leavitt wasn't just a press secretary, or the daughter of a powerful man. She was a reminder you never know who you're dealing with, and kindness should never depend on status. The train surged forward once more, slicing through the East Coast at 150 miles per hour. But inside Car 1A, time seemed to stand still. Caleb Morris had just been escorted back into the car, his face drained of color, his breath uneven. Moments earlier, he'd smugly poured scalding coffee onto Karoline Leavitt's skirt. Now he stood in front of her, publicly exposed, professionally cornered. Across the aisle, passengers sat upright, eyes wide. Some had their phones discreetly raised, Others simply stared in disbelief. The mood had shifted from tension to accountability. People could sense something rare unfolding, true justice happening in real time. Senior Vice President Harold Grant of Leavitt Transportation remained composed as he turned to Karoline and asked, "Would you like to proceed, Miss Leavitt?" Karoline stood slowly, the coffee stain still visible but irrelevant now. Her navy blazer, perfectly tailored, mirrored the strength in her posture. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lash out. Her power came not from volume, but from truth. She looked Caleb in the eye, her words measured and clear. "This isn't about who I am," she said. "It's about how you treated someone you didn't know." That one sentence sliced through the cabin like a knife through silence. A retired Navy officer near the rear nodded firmly. "Darn right," he muttered. "That's exactly it." Caleb opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. His arrogance had dissolved into shame. His hands trembled slightly at his sides as he glanced nervously at the watching crowd. People of all backgrounds, all walks of life, now united by one thing. They had all seen the truth unfold. Harold turned to Caleb with formality that cut deep. "You've been relieved of your duties effective immediately. Step off the train at the next station. You'll be met by authorities for a formal statement." Caleb's voice cracked. "Wait, please, this is just a misunderstanding." Karoline didn't flinch. "No, Caleb. What you did wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a reflection of your character when you thought no one important was watching." Passengers murmured in agreement. The elderly woman with the scarf gave a quiet, resolute clap that quickly spread across the car. Others followed their applause, beginning softly, then swelling a standing ovation not just for Karoline, but for the idea that character still matters. The clapping grew. Even the quiet businessman who hadn't spoken a word earlier now leaned forward, joining the chorus of validation. It wasn't about politics anymore. It wasn't about names. It was about right and wrong, plain and simple. Harold nodded toward the junior supervisor, who motioned to two waiting transit officers already boarding at the next platform. They entered quickly and professionally, wearing navy blue jackets emblazoned with the seal of the Metropolitan Rail Authority. "Mr. Caleb Morris," one asked calmly. "We'd like you to step off the train for questioning regarding an onboard incident." Caleb's face crumpled, his earlier dominance nowhere to be found. "You don't understand. I didn't know." The officer's voice remained steady. "It doesn't matter who she is. It matters what you did." The quote hit the car like thunder. Some passengers actually nodded and murmured, "Exactly." Another elderly man whispered to his wife, "It's about time someone stood up for decency." As the officers gently but firmly escorted Caleb off the train, Karoline sat back down, her expression serene, yet commanding. She hadn't said much. She hadn't needed to. She had let his actions speak for themselves, and America had listened. The moment became bigger than the train. It became a message, one about respect, dignity, and holding people accountable not for who they target, but how they treat the vulnerable when they think no one will notice. As the train pulled out of the Wilmington station again, leaving Caleb on the platform in a blur of flashing lights and trailing apologies, Karoline glanced out the window. The tarmac, the lights, the crowd, it all faded into the distance. Inside the car, the atmosphere was transformed. The tension was gone. It had been replaced by something warmer, relief, unity, pride. An older woman across the aisle leaned in. "You didn't just defend yourself," she said softly. "You reminded all of us what America used to stand for." Karoline smiled gently. "It still can," she replied. "We just have to expect better and not be afraid to say something when we see wrong." The passengers clapped again, not out of pity or politics, but out of respect. Genuine respect. Later that evening, news of the incident began trending online. Clips from passengers, quotes from Karoline, and the footage of Caleb being escorted off the train flooded platforms. Hashtags like #respect in first class and #justice on the rails trended across the country. Cable news channels picked it up within the hour. Pundits debated it, but the viewers didn't. The people watching, especially seniors who had lived through decades of changing values, understood instinctively this wasn't about partisanship. It was about dignity, about grace under fire, about speaking truth without shouting. Karoline Leavitt had once again reminded America of something simple yet essential. The way you treat someone when you think they're powerless reveals exactly who you are. And this time the country was watching. The train rolled steadily through the Virginia countryside. But inside the first-class car, the air still pulsed with something deeper than movement, vindication, relief, and a sense of restored dignity. The moment Caleb Morris was escorted off the train hadn't just been about justice. It had revealed character for better and for worse. And while many eyes were on Karoline Leavitt, the woman who stood tall without ever raising her voice, one pair of eyes had quietly watched everything from the sidelines. Leah Collins, the junior train attendant barely in her 20s, standing by the service door, heart pounding in her chest. She had known something wasn't right from the very beginning. She had seen the way Caleb glared at Karoline, dismissed her boarding pass, mocked her presence. She'd wanted to speak up, but fear, protocol, and rank had held her back. But now, as the applause slowly faded and passengers settled into a new calm, Karoline turned her gaze gently toward Leah. Their eyes met. Leah instinctively stood straighter, unsure if she should say something, apologize, or fade into the background. Instead, Karoline rose from her seat, not with pomp, but with quiet purpose, and stepped toward her. The cabin fell still once again. "You," Karoline said softly, her voice filled with warmth. "I saw you. I saw how you hesitated. I saw how you looked like you wanted to help. And that matters more than you know." Leah's eyes welled up. She tried to respond, but emotion caught in her throat. Her hands fidgeted at her sides, unsure where to go or what to do. Karoline reached out, resting a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We need more people like you," she said with conviction. "People who know the difference between rules and what's right. Expect a call from my office." The words sank in slowly. Leah blinked. "Ma'am, are you serious?" Karoline smiled gently. "Completely. I don't forget courage, especially when it's quiet." The older passengers nearby were visibly moved. A silver-haired woman placed a hand over her heart. A man in a checkered blazer wiped at the corner of his eye. They remembered a time when integrity was rewarded, not ignored, when someone standing in the shadows trying to do the right thing might one day be lifted into the light. Leah nodded slowly, her lips trembling. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't know what to do, but I just couldn't look away." Karoline nodded. "That's exactly what makes you different. You saw wrong, and you cared. That's rare, and that's powerful." Around them, murmurs of admiration bubbled up again. Several passengers clapped softly, not the loud, triumphant kind they gave for Caleb's exit, but the gentler kind, the kind reserved for unsung heroes finally getting their due. Harold Grant, the senior executive who had earlier fired Caleb, stepped over with a smile. "Miss Collins, you'll be hearing from us as well. We don't let good people go unnoticed." Leah's tears finally spilled, but this time they were the kind that cleanse, not sting, the kind born from decades of watching the world reward arrogance, while kindness stood in the shadows. In that moment, many of the older passengers saw themselves in Leah. The years they held back, stayed silent, or were overlooked, despite doing what was right. Now they witnessed something rare, a young woman being seen, valued, and lifted up for her quiet decency. As Leah composed herself, Karoline leaned in with one final whisper. Sometimes the smallest actions change the world more than speeches ever will. Leah nodded, speechless, and stepped back, her shoulders higher, her spirit fuller. The train pressed on toward Washington, D.C. But inside the first-class car, something had shifted permanently. A place once filled with judgment and silence was now buzzing with hope. The lesson wasn't just about removing the wrong. It was about honoring the right. In the back row, an elderly gentleman whispered to his wife, "That girl reminds me of our granddaughter. Maybe this world still has a chance." The wife nodded, wiping a tear, because someone finally noticed. By the time the train pulled into Union Station, Leah had returned to her duties, but with a different energy. Passengers smiled at her now. Some stopped her just to say thank you. And when Karoline stepped off the train to a waiting black SUV, Leah stood near the door watching. Karoline turned, offered a final wave, and said, "Take care, Leah. Keep being who you are." Leah didn't answer right away. She just smiled through her tears and nodded. The kind of nod that says everything without needing a single word. And in that smile was something America needs more of today. Hope, humility, and the quiet strength of knowing you did the right thing, even when no one was supposed to notice. Karoline had fought for dignity and won. But in the end, she didn't just defeat arrogance. She discovered a new leader in the heart of a quiet girl with kind eyes and a spine of steel. And for every senior watching this unfold, it wasn't just a story. It was a reminder that goodness still lives quietly in this country, waiting for someone to recognize it. As the sun dipped low over the Washington skyline, Karoline Leavitt stood at the steps of Union Station, her blazer still slightly damp from the coffee spill hours earlier, but her spirit completely untouched. Reporters clustered near the exit phones and cameras aimed high, desperate to get a quote. Her story had already hit social media like a thunderstorm. Every second of it, Caleb's insult, the shocking coffee incident, the quiet exposure of her family ties, the public firing, and Leah's tearful promotion had turned this ordinary train ride into something unforgettable. A journalist from a major network approached her with a microphone in hand, the camera's red light blinking. "Miss Leavitt," she said breathlessly, "you didn't raise your voice once, and yet the entire country is now talking about what happened on that train. Millions are watching the footage. What's your message for America?" Karoline didn't rush her answer. She looked beyond the camera toward the late afternoon sky, the quiet hum of passing taxis and the soft rustle of flags lining the street. Then, with the grace and clarity that had defined her all day, she spoke. "In a divided world," she said slowly, "dignity is the bridge we forgot to protect. It's time we remember." There was a moment of silence behind the lens. Even the bustling city street seemed to hold its breath. Karoline continued, "Justice didn't ride on a name today. It rode on how you treat strangers, especially when you think no one's watching." The clip went viral within hours. Across the country, Americans of all ages, especially seniors who had lived through decades of cultural shifts, sat up in their living rooms and took notice. Hashtags began to trend by nightfall, #dignity wins and #respect without privilege. On talk radio, callers debated the meaning of true decency. Veterans from Florida to Iowa praised Karoline's composure. A 78-year-old woman in Ohio wrote online, "We need more like her. She didn't fight with fire, she fought with grace." The footage showed more than just an outburst. It captured a moment where restraint defeated rage, where the powerful didn't boast, but guided, where a young junior staffer named Leah reminded America that kindness still had currency. It wasn't about politics anymore. It was about values, about what kind of country we want to leave to our grandkids. Karoline later sat for a longer interview with a national news program. The host, a seasoned anchor with nearly 40 years on the air, leaned forward across the studio desk. "What would you say to everyday Americans watching all this unfold? What's the deeper lesson here?" Karoline smiled, but her eyes were serious. "It's easy to be kind when the cameras are on. The real test is when no one knows who you are. That's where character lives. And this country, our country, has to stop judging people by headlines or assumptions. Start looking at how we treat the people we think don't matter. That's where the soul of America is measured." Her words struck a chord with millions. Clips of the interview circulated across YouTube and Facebook. People began sharing stories of their own, of waiters who were ignored, neighbors who were misjudged, employees who were disrespected for their quiet faith or differing beliefs. Karoline's message became a mirror. Are we building dignity or breaking it down? Senior veterans groups across the Midwest shared the story at monthly meetings. Church bulletins in small towns quoted her closing line. Some even printed it on banners: "Justice didn't ride on a name today. It rode on how you treat strangers." Meanwhile, on the high-speed rail line, company executives reviewed their training policies. Caleb Morris was placed under full investigation, not just for his actions, but for the cultural bias his leadership had revealed. Leah Collins, now promoted, began working with upper management on a project to create the Respect Initiative, a new employee program focusing on unbiased service and human-first treatment. Karoline's story wasn't just a news cycle moment. It became part of a growing conversation, a reminder that in a nation full of tension, the real power still rests in everyday decency. And Karoline, she didn't seek the spotlight that followed. She returned to her role as White House press secretary. She stayed calm during press briefings, kind in crowded rooms, and never once used the incident for political gain, because she knew something too many had forgotten. You don't change hearts by shouting. You change them by showing what quiet strength really looks like. Back on Capitol Hill, a congressman who had never agreed with her politics said during a floor speech, "I may not vote with Karoline Leavitt, but I'll teach my grandkids to act like her." That more than applause was the measure of impact. And for every American watching, especially those who had ever felt overlooked, dismissed, or disrespected, Karoline's message lingered like a light left on in the dark. Dignity isn't loud, but it always wins if we choose to protect it. And as the train of American life races on, one thing is clear. What happened in Car 1 of the 2:30 p.m. Express wasn't just a confrontation. It was a reflection. And maybe, just maybe, a beginning. If this story touched you, hit subscribe and share it with someone who still believes respect is the cornerstone of this country. Join us next time for more stories that restore faith in what America can be, one small act of courage at a time.